and optimizing. As an overview, we're going to talk about the VM and host resource allocation, configuration practices, common issues, and common performance concepts. With VM and host resource allocation, we're going to talk about the resources, quota, licensing, reservation, resource pool, dynamic resource allocation, and physical resource redirect. On resources, common resources that we have are memory, CPU, and disk space. These resources allow the VM to be able to perform. That you have to have physical RAM and you have to have physical CPU for the VM. And if you don't have enough CPU or RAM, then you're not going to be able to host another VM. At the same time, your disk space. You need to have enough disk space so that way you can give it to a VM. If you're loading Windows 7 VM, which uses about 20 to 30 gigs, then you have to have 20 to 30 gigs available for that VM to take. At the same time, it needs at least 1 core and 1 gig of memory. But if that VM is going to be running programs on it, then it needs more than 1 core and it needs more than 1 gig of memory. So you need to have that available. Most servers that host VMs, however, have around 40 cores. And at the same time, they have up to 120 gigs of RAM space. Next thing we're going to talk about is quota. And quota is basically a limit on how many resources the VM can use. There are hard and soft limits when it comes to quota. The soft limit is a limit set but can be exceeded. For example, your Windows 7 VM that you're running, you set a soft limit of 2 gigs of RAM for the VM to use, but you set a hard limit of 4 gigs. Well, as the VM starts using its resources, it might hit that 2 gigs and then exceed that, which is okay. But as soon as it hits that 4 gigs, that's where it stopped and it's not able to go any further. Licensing is usually the most expensive part whenever it comes to any organization. For example, Microsoft Word, you can actually get a free trial of Microsoft Word for so many days and then you can use it. And then once that free trial ends, you're limited on the features you can use, but you can still use Microsoft Word. However, the license can cost up to $120 just for that license. So the license far exceeds the actual cost of the product. That's true for anything. You can download Windows 7 for free, but the license for it can be $70, $80 just for Windows 7. VMware, you can get VMware for free and you'll be able to use it. It'll ask you for the license key, but then the license key for VMware can be in the thousands whenever it comes to an organization. Reservations. Reservations are a set aside of resources that the customer is given to a particular VM. Reservations are usually stated within the contract of the company. If the company's contract says that they will get 3 machines, well then they will get those 3 machines. The same goes for the actual CPU usage or the number of CPUs that they get. Resource pool. Resource pool is very similar to reservations, however, it is a pool of resources that the company is able to use. If their contract states that they get 20 CPU cores, well then in this case they're going to get all 20 CPU cores. That is their reservation and that is also their pool that they're going to receive. So if they need all 20 CPU cores, well then they will get all 20 CPU cores. The purpose behind resource pool is to provide the resources organized for the company and the provider. Next thing we're going to talk about is dynamic resource allocation. Dynamic means changing. So dynamic resource allocation is whenever you provide a computer with the ability to change based on what is needed. If the computer is using more resources, it will dynamically change it so that way it can give it more resources that it needs. The resources might be CPU, memory, disk space, or other things, as for example, the NIC. The next thing we'll talk about is physical resource redirect. Physical resource redirect is whenever you have an actual port on a computer, the host, say a USB port, and you redirect it to the VM. The reason why you want to have that is maybe for the keyboard. You want the VM to use the keyboard, so therefore you do a resource redirect. At the same time, maybe you have an external hard drive where you want the VM to utilize that external hard drive, so you do a resource redirect. The resource redirect isn't limited just to USBs. You can also use the parallel port for printers, or you can use the serial port for other devices like maybe a trackball. Maybe whatever computer you're using, like a CAD, needs a trackball. In configuration practice, we're going to talk about memory ballooning, we're going to talk about the CPU, swap disk space, and disk performance. Memory is usually the limiting factor whenever it comes to a virtual machine. Memory ballooning allows you to exceed that. The operating system uses third-party software to find out if it needs to have more memory or not. Memory blooming gives you a little bit more memory so that way you're able to utilize everything to its full extent. Swap disk space is very similar to page file, but swap disk space is whenever the VM is using all of its memory and then it needs to use a little bit extra, but there is no memory available to it, so therefore it uses a little bit of the hard drive space for memory. It does cause some performance issues, but it does allow you to use more memory essentially on that VM. CPUs have cores in them, and each VM needs a particular core. If you have a quad core machine and you're trying to run 4 VMs, you're going to overtax that CPU, and you're going to have performance issues. If you have a quad core, you can only run 3 VMs. One core is going to be utilized just to the host so it can perform and be able to do the normal functions that it needs to do. But at the same time, the faster the CPU, the more you're able to perform with these VMs. When it comes to VMs, you do need disk space. And if you're running out of disk space, or you're running low on disk space, or you're accessing your hard drive too much, then you could be causing issues inside of your VMs and cause performance issues. On the other hand, RAID allows you to alleviate that. If you remember, there are a few different types of RAID. RAID 5 is the most common one, where it's able to utilize 3 separate hard drives and access information quicker on 3 hard drives versus 1 hard drive. Next, we're going to talk about some common failures with the disk, CPU, and the network. With common disk failures, you have the physical disk failure. You also have disk corruptions and HBA failures. A physical hard disk failure could be a sector on a hard drive that is going bad, and then whenever information is being written to that, it gets corrupted, and then it's not able to utilize that sector anymore. One way to alleviate that is to run a check disk on the physical hard disk. And what this allows you to do is check each sector to see if there are any errors. And if there are errors, then it is noted in the hard drive's controller. So that way it knows not to write to that portion anymore. The HBA would be similar to the actual port that your motherboard is using for the hard drive. And a failure with that would actually cause that port to be unusable. Some common memory failures are the RAM failures and swap file out of space. With the RAM, the chips do go bad and the modules do need to be replaced. However, to replace those modules is a hard process, so replacing the RAM is more efficient. For the network, you do have common failures in it with the speed and the duplex. The speed would be, if your network is running at 100 megs, but you have your VM running at 10 megs, you're going to cause a network failure, or the duplex. With duplex, you have single, half, and full duplex. If your network is running at half duplex, but you have it running at full duplex, you're going to cause some more failures. And then the physical NIC, you could have failures with it. And if the physical NIC fails, well then you're going to have failures in all VMs. So if all VMs are not responding correctly, then you might want to check the actual host and see if it's having issues. Lastly, we have some considerations whenever it comes to performance. The disk, cache, network, bandwidth, latency, quality of service, multi-patching, and load balancing. Each one offers you the ability to increase your network's performance. You increase your disk size or you increase your disk speed, then you're able to write more. Caching allows your computer to do more local operations and not have to go to the internet. The faster your network, the more you're able to give resources out to all users. Bandwidth allows you to give more resources out as a whole. Reducing latency allows your customers to see an improved performance. The lower the latency means that the faster they're getting their information. Quality of service is whenever you provide VoIPs or other VPNs with quality, and allows them to have the highest priority. You want to give your VoIPs, voice over IP, the highest priority so that way they're able to communicate and do what they need to do. Multi-patching gives you redundancy whenever it comes to the storage devices and allows you to have many routes to that storage device. Load balancing allows you to have many ways of getting information out. For example, 2 routers versus 1 router, or 2 file servers that are replicating back and forth versus 1 file server. In this module, we covered VM and host, resource allocation, configuration best practices, common issues, and common performance concepts. My name is Justin Langham with Cyber Area IT.